Hi there, my name is Scott Covert. I have been developing on the Salesforce platform since 2010. I help co-organize the DC Salesforce developer group, and today I just want to talk about some best practices for Apex trigger development on the Salesforce platform. Basically, most people's introduction to Apex triggers come from the admin world. They've been building out workflow rules for all the processes, or I guess these days maybe process builder processes to run through logic, business logic that they need to execute in Salesforce. And eventually they hit a wall where they need code to execute their process. And what a lot of people realize upon taking a deeper dive into the Apex world is that there are a lot of little gotchas. So today I just want to go through some kind of tips and tricks that you can keep in your back pocket. Stuff that I wish I had known when I was starting out that I think could have avoided a lot of late nights and a lot of headaches. So the first concept I want to talk about is that of context. Should my logic live in a before or after trigger? What's a null reference? I keep getting a null reference saying that my record doesn't have an ID, but I don't understand that because all Salesforce records are given IDs automatically, right? An important thing to keep in mind is if you're working in a before insert trigger context, this is actually prior to the point where your new accounts, contacts, whatever records you're dealing with have been committed to the database, and thus they don't yet have an ID. A lot of people need to run logic where they kind of have a map of their records keyed based on record IDs. And if you do this in a before insert trigger context, you're going to have problems because all of those records IDs are null, and thus your map is always going to have one element for whatever the last record, the last S-object record that was inserted into that map was, right? So just something to keep in mind. In a before insert trigger context, you don't have record IDs. And there are other things too to watch out for when it comes to context. In an after trigger context, now this is either insert or update, or delete for that matter. But of course, in that case, the record's already gone. In the after context, your record has already, or records have already been committed to the database, and this means you can no longer perform business logic that manipulates a field on that record or those records. So this is logic you would want to have in a before trigger context. If you need to perform some calculation to automatically populate a specific field, you're going to want to do that in a before context trigger because you'll have an exception thrown if you try to do that in an after context trigger. Another thing to keep in mind when you're working on your Apex triggers, and really Salesforce development at large for that matter, you always want to make sure that your code is bulkified. A lot of folks start out writing logic that assumes they're always dealing with a single record. You want to really treat your trigger.new and trigger.old maps as if they have 200 records in them. And that's because by default, Salesforce will run your Apex trigger logic in batches of 200 records. So you always want to make sure that your logic is ready to handle that. If you have some sort of process that assumes you're only going to be dealing with a single record, you can run into a lot of problems. Another common misstep is putting SOQL queries inside for loops. So this is a great way to blow up your governor limits. If you're looping through, say, maybe all the records being processed, that can be, like I said, up to 200 records at a time. And and you might actually have your logic run in multiple batches if you're inserting, say, 1,000 records. So having a query inside a loop that iterates over this entire list of records will definitely throw an exception at some point, because you're limited to how many queries you can run in a single execution context. So it's always better, instead of having SOQL queries inside of for loops, to instead populate, say, maybe a list of IDs that you need and query outside of any for loop. So by that I mean, let's say you have a trigger running based on contacts, and you want to find all the related accounts. Instead of having a for loop that iterates over each contact and within the loop doing a query to find the related account, you could instead iterate over all the contacts and store all of their account IDs in a list, and then run a single query outside of the for loop that just pulls down all of those related accounts at one time. Another mistake is putting logic inside of Apex triggers. It's best practice to keep your triggers basically void of any logic whatsoever, and instead have all of that code sitting in Apex classes. This makes your code much more maintainable going forward. And also, if you have this logic sitting in an Apex class instead of a trigger, you can work on making sure that all of your code is context agnostic. And by that I mean, applying kind of the service layer approach discussed by Andy Fawcett's Apex architecture book, where you have a service layer that performs all of your business logic in such a way that it doesn't care whether it's being called from an Apex trigger or a visual force controller. The point is, this logic is the same no matter how it's called, and it should be processed as such. So it's best to always keep your logic inside Apex classes and not have anything really in the true trigger itself. And eventually, this will also make your unit test much simpler by employing this method. Don't have multiple triggers for one single object. The Salesforce platform does not give you any sort of control over the execution order of Apex triggers. So it's much better to really just have a single trigger on account, and again, void of any logic, that just calls some sort of account trigger handler class or classes to then implement all the business logic you need in the exact order that you want it to be run. So it can be kind of like a maintenance nightmare if you have all these different Apex triggers, such as account trigger 1, account trigger 2, account trigger 3. All your logic lives inside them. You don't really know what they do anymore. Because of scope creep and things like that, more and more logic is being stuffed into specific triggers, and you can run into problems where you don't know the execution order of the triggers. So you might have some sort of interdependency between the triggers that could cause you problems, and just a whole bunch of headaches can arise from this. So once again, you can avoid this by just having a single trigger that calls a trigger handler class or classes for that object. Recursion. Watch out for this. So this is this is the case where you have some sort of Apex trigger on, let's say, the account object, and you write logic that then spins up another account. Let's say maybe you have some sort of logic that determines, oh, this is a parent account, and we should spin off a subsidiary account. But this causes the problem where now this new account that you insert or update is going to also fire your Apex trigger. And you can get into this state of recursion where basically the trigger logic keeps calling itself. You can really quickly blow through your governor limits that way. Spaghetti code. Basically, avoid repeating yourself as much as possible in your code. It's always best to modularize, break up everything into specific methods if you can. And again, move all logic from Apex triggers themselves and into classes that are organized in a way that makes sense for your organization. So you want to make sure you don't have some sort of Frankenstein type code source where a bunch of developers have cobbled together somewhat working pieces, and now no one individual could really follow the flow of logic from beginning to end. Make sure to look out for the Salesforce developer blogs, blogs from MVPs, Salesforce posts themselves, maybe on success groups, chatter groups, things like that, for best practices, because a lot of people have been in your shoes, and everyone has to start at the beginning, right? So all these best practices are there for your benefit. So I would highly advise you to take a look for them and apply them to your development workflow. So again, just taking a quick look over at context, you want to set and change field values before writing to your database. So by that I mean in a before context trigger. But keep in mind you're not going to have an ID value yet if you're in a before insert. If you're in an after insert, then you can safely create record maps keyed by ID values. But again, if you're in an insert, you don't have a trigger.old or a trigger.old map. And the reason being, obviously, if you're performing an insert, there is no prior instance of those records to utilize. And just be careful, again, of recursion, updating the original object that the Apex trigger is firing on. These are just some links to some cheat sheets on the concept of context, trigger context, that I would highly recommend you go out and take a look at. Bulkification. Yeah, so another use case that I forgot to mention before is if you have trigger logic that is not bulkified, then the next time you or an admin runs a data load, you're going to have a lot of problems. Right, because now you're inserting all these records at once, and there's a very good chance that you're going to start running into governor limits. And if that happens, your admins aren't going to be happy with you. So this is just some code to show you what I mean by bulkification, and this is a don't do this example, right? So this is here we can see calling just the first record from the trigger.new list to get an account, and then querying for all of those related contexts. If we have 200 accounts inserted at once, basically our Apex trigger logic is only going to work for the first record. The other 199, those contacts aren't going to be queried. Okay, so here's an example of a bulkified trigger. You can see here we iterate over the trigger.new list in our logic, and then in this manner, even if we have 200 accounts being processed here, we should be good. All of their descriptions are going to be populated. I just want to mention too, just to make things simpler for demonstration purposes, I do obviously have logic here in the trigger, but once again, it's best practice to move any business logic outside of triggers and into Apex classes. Here is a link to a cheat sheet on the concept of bulkification that can explain in further detail what it means and how you can apply it to your work. Again, do not perform queries inside of for loops, period. This is a really big no-no. Will almost assuredly start causing you to hit governor limits. So here's an example where we run a query for contacts, related contacts, while looping over all accounts that are within our Apex trigger. And this is an example of what not to do. Okay, so here is an example of how you can use relationship queries to instead query for all the accounts with their child contacts when the Apex trigger is initially fired, right? So you can see kind of this inner query for all the related contacts, and we're searching for all accounts where the ID is in the key set of our trigger.new map. And in this way, we've avoided running any sort of SOQL queries inside of our for loop. Again, here's another link where you can look into this concept a little further. Keep your code base dry, and by that I mean don't repeat yourself as much as possible. And once again, a good way to start this is removing any logic from inside of your Apex triggers. So here's an example of an Apex trigger with a lot of logic living inside of it, and it would be better to instead extrapolate that and put it into a specific class. Okay, so here's a link on building ignorant triggers where all business logic has been migrated to Apex classes. Okay, so taking this concept a step further, I would highly recommend looking into some sort of a centralized framework so that you can have better control over your Apex trigger execution order. You can prevent recursion, and you can minimize the chance of spaghetti code. These are links to some different options for centralized frameworks. Basically, they all have the same concept of moving logic outside of triggers and instead putting it into Apex classes. And they even take it a step further, like I had said, to allow you to write specific logic. Let's say you want certain logic to be performed if your trigger was fired in a queuable Apex context versus how it should perform if it were fired from a batch job context, right? So you have a lot of control when you start implementing something like this. For beginners, it can seem like a lot of overhead and a little confusing, I'll admit. So it's not necessarily going to be the best fit for your organization, your needs, but definitely worth looking into. And this is just a link to additional information on utilizing a trigger framework. One of the final things I want to talk about is, as developers, we have a tendency to always solve our problems through code. And Salesforce has done a lot of work to make sure that code is basically a last resort for our business logic, right? So don't forget that sometimes the simplest solution is the best one. And if you can write a process builder process or some sort of workflow rule, it might be a good idea to do that instead of writing an Apex trigger. So don't forget that. Don't get discouraged. You will almost assuredly run into a lot of issues now that you've started writing Apex code, and especially when it comes to governor limits. And a lot of beginners initially, I think, get frustrated because they don't understand why these governor limits are preventing them from doing things that they need to do. But actually, I've found over time that having the governor limits there is kind of nice because it in a way forces you to write better code. a lot of the concepts that are employed or that are necessary in a multi-tenant architecture are best practice even outside of multi-tenant architecture. So I think in the end it helps, but just try and keep your head up when you're banging your head against the wall trying to figure out what's wrong with your code. Okay, so the source for this presentation is available on my GitHub page to be downloaded and run locally, and it also can be run through GitHub.io. Thanks very much for joining me to talk about Apex Trigger best practices.